So I would now like to begin by acknowledging the lands that we are on. Today, many of us are spread out around the world. Considering this, I would like to invite everyone to reflect personally on the land where you find yourself today, and maybe you would like to even share it in the chat. So personally, I'm speaking to you today from Toronto on the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, Toronto has a treaty with the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation and is part of the Dish with One Spoon agreement to share the lands between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee nations. Looking out today at the snow-covered landscape, I feel incredibly grateful to have grown up in such a beautiful place and to call it my home. However, as a non-Indigenous settler to this land, it is also essential to acknowledge that these lands and those Indigenous to these lands have been subjected to the ideological, physical, emotional, and spiritual violence of both colonizers and settlers. Despite this, Indigenous communities across Turtle Island and around the world have resisted and continue to resist these harmful forces, and also continue to stand at the front lines of cultural and environmental protection and social justice. So today, I wish to express my gratitude and acknowledge my responsibility to resist and deconstruct harmful narratives of modern day colonialism and work instead towards responsible and reciprocal relationships. In the spirit of relationship building, I am very pleased to present our speaker for today, Wambui Karanja. Wambui is a PhD candidate in the Department of Social Justice Education at OISE UofT, and today she will be presenting her research on Who Owns the Land, Centering Indigenous Conceptions of Land in Africa, the Case of Kenya. Wambui, thank you so much for being here. I will now pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Louise, for organizing this or having me here, and also the Department of Social Justice Education and the Center for Indigenous Education Research. It's actually a great honor to be able to present my research so far. As you heard, my name is Wambui. I'm a PhD candidate in SJE, and just at the point where I have just completed my data correction, and I'm in the process of analyzing the data for writing. So I will be presenting my research up to the point where I'm at, and what I've done so far, but mostly grounding my research on my presentation on what my research is about. So for self-location, I identify. And I'm sorry, I don't have the slides. I have it, but I'll probably send it to Lois to post. I identify as a Black African Indigenous woman, and also as a person who grew up on the land in Kenya. I grew up in the rural area, doing farming and those kinds of stuff in Kenya. I'm also diasporic in the sense that I'm here in Canada, and also identify as very much implicated in the colonial project itself, as a beneficiary of colonial education, both in Canada and in Kenya, where I started my education. And currently, in the last few years, I've been on a journey of decolonizing myself. And I can say that I came to this journey after joining OISE, so kudos to OISE for invoking that in me. I think I always had it, but I did not have the language to use to articulate exactly what I wanted to, what I was thinking about, or what I've always thought was important. So in terms of my research, it is located in Kenya. Kenya is an East African country. It is bordered by several countries: Uganda, Somalia, South Sudan, the Indian Ocean, and Tanzania. It has a population of about probably 50 million now. And it was a British colony from 1920 to 1963, when Kenya regained its independence from British colonial rule. So that is the period, that is a period that is going to be very critical in my research, because it is what undergirds the reasons for my study. So the study community itself, it's hard to study a whole country. We have 49 tribes in the country who speak different languages. And I use the word tribe very carefully because I know it's also a very contested term. But I use it as from a position of strength. I want to regain it from the way it has been interpreted in the colonial project. So the Gikuyu community, and that is the community I'm born in, speak the language Gikuyu. It is, and they identify as the Agikuyu or people who belong to that community. In English books, you find them referred to as Kikuyu, which is an anglicized version, but we are also beginning to reclaim the actual name Gikuyu. And that is a community that that I'm talking, my research is buttressed on. It is the largest tribe in Kenya and comprises about 20% of the Kenyan population. It is also the tribe that is seen to be most advanced in colonial times, but that is also another important aspect because we need to trouble that concept of advanced in terms of the colonial discourse and in terms of decolonization. The Kikuyu community is agricultural. It also ontologically, it practices an oral tradition where information and knowledge is passed on from generation to generation, very much like what happens in most indigenous communities. And the descendants, they consider themselves descendants of their ancestral father and mother, who again are called, the father is called Gikuyu and the mother is called Mumbi. And the name Mobi stands for creator. So they are generally known to call themselves as the House of Mumbi. And it is a community that fought fiercely for Kenya's independence from British colonial rule. And I think the history of the Gikuyu itself in that struggle is the one that is most documented, even though other communities participated in the struggle, but they are the ones that seem to have spearheaded that. There was a very big war of resistance that was fought by the faction that fought colonial rule called the Mau Mau. And anybody who has read Kenyan history will read about the Mau Mau. Of course, it has been theorized in very many different ways, depending on who it is that is theorizing the resistance. But it is the Mau Mau War of Independence is what really heralded the end of the beginning of the end of British colonial rule in Kenya. So what is my research problem that I'm trying to address? The country, Kenya itself, as a British colony, had, I think, the loss of land in Kenya as a result of British colonial rule is what undergirds my research. And also the enduring colonial legacies that have resulted in increased land loss and dispossession, even after Kenya supposedly got its independence. I'm talking of political independence, not economic independence, and even political, whether it became political independent is also highly contested and a concept that needs to be troubled. So there are less up to today, apart from what was experienced during colonial times, there is still subsisting and existing alienation and disengagement from the land for many people. And that has wrought a lot of violence, land-related violence. It has, my research is also regarded by the fact that there is very, very limited literature on indigenous Gikuyu conceptions of land, resulting out of that disengagement from the land as a result of British colonial rule and colonization. And then there's even less limited, more limited theorizing on land and indigeneity. So when scholars, Kenyan scholars and scholars from who write about Kenya talk about land, they rarely use any decolonizing perspectives and rarely use the anti-colonial and see Kenya as a country where colonialism has clearly ended. So I'm troubling that concept as well in my research, and that's why I'm using an anti-colonial and decolonial theorizing framework instead of the post-colonial, because I do believe that colonialism in Kenya is very live. And in fact, it's probably, apart from the violence, and that is also contested, it's probably just the way it was. It just has changed different tactics. So the research questions I'm addressing what the Gikuyu, I want to understand what the Gikuyu indigenous conceptions of land were. And really, it is kind of invoking that knowledge and reminding ourselves of what they were, because they were there. And then wanting to learn how those conceptions have changed and whether people think they have changed in the first place, and how those conceptions of land can be reasserted or reclaimed, and if they should be reclaimed in the first place, and then what the pedagogical implications of that reclaiming would be. Because my study is housed in the SJE, it is imperative that I bring an educational edge to the research. So I just want to know how, what would happen for education in Kenya if people thought differently about land, or if it was informed by indigenous conceptions of land. In my research, I'm applying an anti-colonial theory, and then the decolonial framework grounded in indigenous knowledge theory. And my research methodology involves in-depth interviews. And these interviews, because of COVID, are being done virtually. So my earliest application was for virtual research, virtual interviews, and then using purposive sampling as a way of data correction. So that basically is is where my research is, what grounds my research. In the next phase, I'm going to look at the conceptions of land, because it's important that I buttress where I'm going from where I started. So what were the conceptions of land in indigenous African thought? First, how do Africans think about land when they talk about it, and how important is it to them? So I'm looking at how land for Kenyans and Africans is understood as a spiritual, as connected to spirit. And here I'm going to reference scholars like Day and Professor Day and one who have written prolifically on spirituality in Africa and the connection with land. It is also seen as a source of education, a source of knowledge for Kenyans and Africans. And then there are a lot of, and then as a source of identity in terms of where Africans get their identity from. So there is a deep, profound relationship with the land. And there is one universal aspect of land that that straddles every African belief, every belief in any country in Africa about land, and that is that land cannot be owned. The Western concept of owning land is foreign to the African, in indigenous African thought, and this also is reflected in Kenya. The literature shows that land belongs not just to the living, the people who hold it, but belongs to the ancestors. And in most African cosmological beliefs, land is gifted from a higher power. And in different communities, that higher power is defined differently. So the Western concept of owning land is totally out. There's really nothing like that. You cannot own land. In fact, in my studies on relationships with on definitions of land in Canada, in Turtle Island, the way they define land is very much the way we see land in Africa. And the people who have it now hold it in trust for the unborn. So when Western philosophies bring this concept of ownership, there is a form of disinheritance, because you're owning something that you cannot own. You did not create it, you cannot own it. So that concept is very, very critical. It is seen as a sacred gift from God, and is bequeathed to the present generation by the ancestors, and the present generation holds it in trust for the unborn. So it does. It's a very important concept, because that is one of the disruptions that happened with British colonial rule, the colonization of land. And apart from that, it is also seen as an embodiment of the creator. So when you think about land, it's not just about land that gives you sustenance. It embodies the creator, it embodies the spirit, and also connects you to your ancestors. So the place of land is seen as very critical. And my research is actually trying to look at how those definitions of land and how they play out in the continent, in Africa, and whether there are any disparities. But so far, I haven't come across anything that talks differently. Maybe I will find something, but I haven't come across anything that defines land differently outside of that paradigm. So the Gikuyu themselves, as Africans, have the same beliefs about land. For the Gikuyu, the belief is that land belongs to, that land is a gift from God, and their God is, the Gikuyu God is, I hesitate to use the word God because that was not there before colonization. The Gikuyu God is called Mwenenyaga in Kikuyu, and he is said to have resided on the highest point of the land, which is Mount Kenya. So when the Gikuyu play, they play facing Mount Kenya. And because that is where God resides. And of course, Mount Kenya again is connected, is part of the land. So you can see how significant land is as the abode of God. Again, as in African cosmology, there is no concept of individual ownership of land among the Gikuyu. And everybody in the community was guaranteed user rights, or everybody had user rights to the land, not rights of ownership, as in the West. There were institutions that ensured that everybody had access to land. The other important concept among the Gikuyu was the concept of concurrent rights to use the land, so that if you were farming a piece of land, another person had a right to come onto the land and probably put beehives on the land. They had rights of passage through the land. There were communal lands where cattle could go and, they were called salt licks, where the cattle could go and graze, or the liver beds where the cattle could just go and drink the water from the liver. So all these concepts were show the communality, the sense of communal ownership and use of land. So the idea that you could actually enclose a piece of land and exclude others was foreign to the Gikuyu people. So that communal ownership was critical. And again, it's the concept that the place land holds among the Gikuyu is so central that if you do not have land, you are not seen as an adult. You are not seen as a person who has grown up. It gives you your identity as a person. So it becomes very, very critical in Gikuyu thought. But the question is, how is that today? What has colonialism done to that belief system about land? So we now come to the colonial encounter and find before the colonialists, that is how people thought about land. And we now come to the colonial encounter. And by colonial encounter, I mean there is the historical perspective, starting from the Berlin, starting really from the early explorers. and then the missionaries who came to Africa and to probably most other colonial destinations. And then the occupation, the Berlin Conference, when Western power sat and decided to divide Africa among themselves. So that is significant because that is when actual territory, annexation of territory started. And then we look at the issue of the colonial land laws that were brought. And in Kenya, for example, the way land theft and laws were orchestrated was through a very orchestrated legal mechanism that in 1915 actually dispossessed all Kenyans of land, whether they were, including the land on which they were living on. So we have an ordinance that declares that all land in Kenya, including land that was inhabited by the Kenyans, by the local people, became Crown land. So at that point, Kenyans became tenants of the British Crown. They had no rights to land whatsoever. And that is what actually completed the colonization of, the legal colonization of land. A situation that was given judicial affirmation in a very leading case where that issue was decided. It was held that Kenyans did not have any rights to land whatsoever, even including the land on which their households stood. So the question was, what other tools, apart from the legal mechanism, what tools did they use to dispossess Kenyans? Because people were not just passive. Kenyans were not passive in their colonization. They actually resisted. But the British were actually very violent in the way they stole the land. And one of they use very odious administrative maneuvers like taxation, villagization, then economic deprivation. They would also use detention, extreme forms of violence. And I would encourage anybody who wants to know about the violence to read a book by Elkins that was published in 2005, where she actually articulates the extreme violence that people went through, very, very degrading kinds of violence. I tried reading the book myself, I could not. The emotion it evoked in me was so bad, I could not read it. So I would encourage anybody to read that book because it is the one that showed, it's called Britain's Gulag in Kenya. And it shows the lights of the very violent past history that the British government had with Kenya. They also introduced systems like taxation. So people were supposed to be, they put people in villages to control the land, to remove them from the land and control it. And then they introduced taxation, which you could only pay through money. So people were forced now to leave the villages to go and work on the European farms to make the money to pay the taxes. So it was a mess. And again, scholars like Kanogo in 1987 and Lodney in 1972 have written very much on that subject. So we grew up hearing stories of colonial violence, and it was not something to, yeah, I really do not know how they endured that. But the good thing is that the revolt was successful, and independence was achieved. I do not say it was granted because it was fought for and achieved by Kenyans. So what were the implications of colonial land laws? And this is what we now are beginning to see after the British left in 1963. And I say left because that is when the Kenyan flag was raised and the Union Jack came down. So there was land theft, disinheritance and dislocation. There was also transformation of the country's land holding practices from communal ownership that I spoke before to now individual ownership, where people could enclose or entitled to a piece of land that was registered in their name, and they had exclusive rights of user of that land to them, and were able to exclude anybody else. So we are seeing a situation where land now became commoditized or commodified and was enclosed. So things like salt licks that places like salt licks like people used to use communally were no longer there. You could not go and set up beehives on another person's land. Rights of way were also taken away from this individualization of land platforms. And then, of course, in short, all customary systems of tenure of land holding were extinguished when land became privatized and registered in the names of individual members. So the two main aspects that that actually were the result of this dispossession and loss were the commodification of land, that land became property, and then the fact that the transformation of customary land holding practices, that now people became landless. People who did not have land and who would have been catered for during the pre-colonial times were now left landless. And then, of course, with commodification comes the proprietization of land and taking land into the marketplace. So it ended up that there came to be a very robust land market where now land was traded. And it is important to think about how the British orchestrated this before they left, or they technically left. There's a piece of legislation in Kenya called the Registered Land Act, which has now been repealed. And that act was passed at the cusp of independence in 1963, just a few months before. And in that act, one of the most significant sections says that land that was registered in the name of a person could not be, that legislation could not be challenged, even if the land was obtained by fraud. And of course, we know why that was happening. It was meant to actually secure British land rights post-independent in the post-independence period. And I'm saying post-independence again in a very measured way. So those Europeans who chose to remain in Kenya had their titles protected now from by this new piece of legislation. The other important thing that happened in Kenya through those land titling programs was that when the British left, they made sure that they stole land from the freedom fighters and gave it to the people who supported them. So that has remained up to now, that the people who benefited from colonization, from the end of colonization, were the people who actually were the functionaries of the British government. And so really, even though we can say that there was colonization, the end of colonization in Kenya, it was just a change of the system. The people who were supporters of the colonial government ended up benefiting from the land. And there was a very big land redistribution scheme, but the people who could buy land were only those who had the money, and those who had the money were the ones who were able to actually support the colonial government. So really, there was just a change of guard, but not a change of, not a redistribution of land. It is a very, very significant aspect in my study, particularly in an area of Kenya called Kiambu, where there are a lot of local landlords who hold the coffee estates that used to belong to the white people. So that poverty and whatever has continued up to the present day. So this brings me to the question, who owns the land then? If this is the situation, who owns the land? There is a lot of landlessness in Kenya. In about 10 years ago, there was a very fierce, there was a lot of violence, land-based violence, where people were fighting. People who are landless were actually trying to reclaim their lands from the lands that used to belong to their families. And a lot of people died. It was something that garnered international attention. And land has also been used as a political tool every time there are elections. That this year, like this year, which is an election here in Kenya, all those reverberations of issues of land come about, and people get displaced, and a lot of people get killed. So the other issue that arose out of the colonial encounter with relation to land is also the issue of education. That education was meant, that was introduced, the colonial education introduced was not meant to bring you back to the land. It was meant to disengage you from the land. The use of language. We learn in Kenya to go to work. We do not learn to become better people. Well, I remember when I was in high school myself, I knew more about Canada than I knew about my country. And unfortunately, this has still continued. The curriculum itself is highly colonial. It does not teach any Kenyan child to even know about themselves or know about their country. So, and of course, Gulag has written extensively about that. So we see the role of colonial education in the dispossession in the colonization of people's minds, so that they do not look at land. We also see the role of religion itself, and the parties pray. There is this famous saying that the British, when the missionaries came, they told us to close our hands and to close our eyes to pray. And when we opened our eyes, they had our land and we had the Bible. And unfortunately, that has remained up to today. And it may not be in so clear terms, but really, religion has played a very significant role in dispossessing people of lands. And again, with religion came the demonization of African spirituality, in the sense that it was said to be demonic. And again, and spirituality and medicine, and African medicine, indigenous medicine, were very closely connected. So the loss of African spirituality, or the degradation of spirituality, also added in the loss of knowledge about African indigenous medicines. So the question comes to what can be done? How do we connect people back to the land, and how can we get people to think differently? I myself grew up on the land. I grew up picking coffee, milking cows, and that kind of thing, something I'm now very proud of, and which previously I would not have been. I'm here, living here, and somehow, even though spiritually connected to the land, not physically connected to it, there is a lot of urbanization. There is a lot of land pressure in Kenya because of population growth, a lot of urbanization because of education that tells people that you go to school, you go to university to get a job. You don't go to university to become a better person or to know how to live with in your community or to improve your community. So there is a lot of unemployment, a lot of land pressure, like I said, a very unfortunate situation where land is getting subdivided into very small pieces that are not commercially viable. And what that does is that it interferes with those places that were circled, like the burial sites were circled. The ancestral shrines are no longer there, or they are disappearing. Places that are where elders would go and commune are not there anymore. And places where medicine, the forests where medicines used to, traditional herbs and whatever used to be harvested, are no longer there. So the whole of that milieu undergirds my study, and I aim to ask the question, what is it that we have lost, the Kenyans have lost, or the Gikuyu people themselves have lost, if that is how they see land, only as a commodity? And I can tell you that the land market is very, very lucrative now. It's more expensive. Land is more expensive in Kenya than it is in Canada. I see when I look at even issues of a house is with the Kenyan economy and the Canadian economy so different in terms of size. Houses in Kenya are costing more than houses in Canada, and a piece of land, like, yeah, it's just impossible. It's just crazy, the kind of land market that has evolved out of the commercialization of land. And of course, that goes with the loss of all those traditional institutions of land, that institutions that were that involved or were held under the auspices of land. So my research is trying to see whether we can reclaim African indigenous conceptions of land. Can we go back and think about land differently? And what would that mean for our identity as Africans and as Kenyans? And secondly, how would that resurgence inform any educational officialities? What impact would it have on education in Kenya and even in the diaspora? So I'm looking at issues of indigeneity as indigeneity being an entry point into the research to see whether it can reclaim our indigenous land-based epistemologies or our indigenous relationships with the land, and though also try to imagine new educational officialities that might arise out of that resurgence. And of course, looking to see whether there would be any implications for further research. So, like I said, I'm at the point where I am beginning to code the data. I do not know what the results will be. Looking at the research, I can see trends that are beginning to show up, even though the data has not been analyzed. And I'm actually very excited to see what the data will show. I did my research remotely, and of course that came with its own opportunities and challenges. And as a person who has lived in the areas that I'm researching, I belong there. That's where I belong. So I'm very aware of my own biases and very reflexive in the way I will analyze the data. I also I've also lost the opportunity to be able to read the body language of the people I interviewed, just because I had to do it remotely. So, but I'm excited. I'm really, really excited about the research and waiting to see what it will show. And because I haven't analyzed anything, and that's where I'm at, I don't have anything more to report on my research. But that is what I'm doing, and that actually is the end of my presentation. So thank you so much. And in Swahili, we say asante sana. In my language, I would say negado. So thank you. And I would like, if possible, to have a few questions. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Wambui, for such a fascinating talk, for sharing your research, for sharing the stories of everything. I would like to open the floor to anyone who has a question to raise your hand or just type it in the chat, and we can go from there. So I see Shadia has a question.
Hi, thank you very much for your great presentations. Very interesting topic that you're working on. Asante sana. Mie ni Shadia, nimetokea Tanzania.
Oh, karibu.
So it's always great to see another fellow East African doing amazing work. So asante sana.
Karibu sana.
Nilikuwa nataka kukuuliza, I wanted to ask a question on if you had some time. Well, you mentioned a little bit briefly on education. So I wanted to get a little bit more in terms of what were you looking at when you were talking about or doing research on the decolonial aspect of education from a land perspective, but also from the education component in East Africa? Because this is something that I personally am interested in. So I was just curious if you've done any work, what have you come across, or what are you looking at in that area?
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for asking that. I think it's a great question, and I have actually done some research on education myself at OISE, mostly based on elders' cultural knowledges, and I've recently published a book with Professor Day and another student. So I'm looking at the role colonial education played in the dispossession of land, and it's informed by the way the colonial curriculum, the education curriculum in colonial times was crafted to disengage people from the land. I have actually it was some of my research questions actually touched on the role of education and what it does, the role that it played. So I intend to, in my work, I intend to look at how education, how we can change the educational curriculum in Kenya and in Africa so that it reflects, because in the indigenous knowledge comes from the land, and that is what has been actually been disengaged. Education and land have been disengaged. So the question is, again, how do we bring these two together so that people start looking at the land as their source of knowledge? And unfortunately, fortunately, I can say that in my research, I was able, when I was doing my research, I was able to interview people who actually are beginning to draw that connection. They are beginning to see the role of land in education, and are looking to see how they can revive indigenous African education, even within the school curriculum. Kenya recently has introduced indigenous learning in schools, where children are supposed to learn in their own languages up to a certain level. The question is, there is still a challenge on how it is being implemented. So I can see there is some kind of resurgence beginning to happen, but that resurgence is happening within a very Eurocentric platform of education. So unfortunately, there isn't, even though there is an element of acknowledging that need to indigenize the curriculum, it is still happening within the framework of a Eurocentric curriculum. And so it's beginning to look, even though it started as something that is very revolutionary, it's beginning to look like an add-on. And I want to bring that to highlight that in my research. So I have some research that I have come across that is very, very critical to education. I've looked at issues of using the issue of community or land-based education as opposed to community-based education. I'm looking at issues of how language can be decolonized within the education system. So they are all very clinical, very important perspectives that that education, the decolonization of education in Africa and in Kenya can play in connecting people to the land as well. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but yeah, maybe we can talk a little bit again. And I can also reference some research that I've come across that speaks to those issues.
Thank you very much. Asante sana.
Karibu.
Thank you, Wambui. I think Professor has a question.
Yeah. Thank you, Wambui, for such a delightful, enlightening presentation that you gave us in terms of who owns the land. It's a very contentious issue in Kenya. It's people have died for that, and people have fought for that, and so on and so forth. So thank you for taking that as your topic because it's so central to our own politics, our own education, and so on, and even our own settlement as people of African descent from Kenya. So my question is, colonization came, disrupted us. Colonization came, took our land. Colonization came and literally displaced us mentally, physically, and psychologically. That's why we are here in Canada, not because we want to be, but whether we like it, whether it's directly part of that, it's part of that colonial planning to dislocate us, to move us from where we are, and so on and so forth. And based on what you have said, and also because, being from there, the question I want to ask is, should we be focusing on the colonizer to solve our land problems? Or should we be focusing on us to be the ones to solve the many colonial problems that we have? Because we do know that the colonizers, the ones that were left behind, they still own thousands and thousands of acres. Dalalama, Delaware, or whatever his name is, if you go to a place like Nanyuki, if you go to your place of on your way to Nakuru, those are huge pieces of land that is owned by the grandchildren of the colonizers. And you also said in your presentation that if you go to a place like Kiambu, they're still Kenyans who might say, when you read Fanon's work, who are Black. So they have Black masks, but inside them, they are very white inside themselves, and so on and so forth. Knowing that the complexity and the intricate setup of this colonial takeover, and then it's handed over from, to a few. And looking at, educators and scholars like you, the elite, do you have any suggestions in terms of what kind of conversations should we as Kenyans start having without having to kill each other in terms of the land?
Wow, thank you so much, Professor Wan, for articulating that. And it's a question really that it has been one of the questions that has been going through my mind because the task looks so daunting. The tools of colonization that are still so deeply embedded in our fabric, in our economic, social, and political fabric, are still reworking themselves in the age of, and you can see what is happening with the globalization, policies from the World Trade Organization itself, modernization, all these modernization theories, development, so-called development theories. So the fabric itself is so tightly woven, and the colonizer is still inventing and reinventing himself to be able to continue this grab the hold it has on economies and countries like Kenya. The question is, of course, the tools are still there. They still use the same tools. It may not be violence in the way it was orchestrated against the Kenyans that the Mau Mau fought for. But violence is still there. There's psychological, emotional, economic, and even physical violence, because I can tell you that the election violence that happens in most African countries has its roots elsewhere in the colonial project or in the neo-colonial project. The question is, they have the weapons, they have the economy, they have all these things. Where can we begin? And this is what the part that undergirds my study. Like, we have to ask ourselves the question, who are you as an African woman as an African man, as an African person, who are you? Because that is what we have lost. There's a community member who is a friend of mine who said that if you do not know where you are going, any road can take you there. And we seem to have lost the sense of where we are going. So other people have defined us. When we start to define ourselves, to reclaim who we are and who we were, that I see as a vantage point, and that's why my research is rooted in indigeneity. We have to reclaim our indigenous selves. Once you are rooted, and once you have that strength, then you can channel that. And first of all, start by decolonizing how you think about yourself, and then using that strength to be able to withstand these other onslaughts that are coming to you. For me, indigeneity, rooting ourselves in indigeneity and rediscovering who we are is extremely important. And that, because that also informs how you negotiate. Instead of negotiating like the way we now do, as actually I wouldn't even say that there are negotiations now, because it's just one part talking and deciding what they want to do so that they can divide the loot and the spoils among themselves. Because actually in negotiation rooted in an African sense of self is what is going to evoke the change that we want. And unfortunately, we seem to have lost that. I'm hoping in my research that I can invoke that. I can help people start to think differently about the way they think about themselves, so that when they present themselves to the world, wherever they are, they know how they are rooted. They know who they are. And then, because if the mind, it can be colonized, but it cannot be taken. It's still there, we need to reclaim it. And when we reclaim, then we start asserting it. And then we research it. So that, for me, I see as a beginning, the starting point. I think we can, I cannot see it happening within the ruling parties and whatever, but I can see if that change begins to happen in the younger children, and that's why education is so critical. That can be a good starting point, but it begins with, first of all, knowing who we are, so that we do not get other people to define it for us, because really, right now, I don't know that we are even pushing our own agenda. The agenda that is pushed through the nation state, which is itself a colonial invention, is actually something that that is critical, that we begin to understand that we are definitions, we are clones of the colonial government, and so they can still continue playing the ball the way they always have. They can do some cosmetic changes here and there, but the core of colonialism is still there. We really have to reclaim our indigenous selves, and by reclaiming our indigenous selves, it means reclaiming our relationships with the land, our relationships with our spirituality, our relationships with our forms of education, the way we used to educate ourselves, or the way we used to pass knowledges, the way we relate to each other. Because really, when you think, and Joki, you are aware of this, when you think about institutions like the Athami, the institutions like the Ahoy, all those are institutions that took care of everybody, the communal sense of caring for everybody. And that is also rooted in the Ubuntu philosophy of I am because you are, and because you are, therefore I am. So all these things need to happen. It has to start with us thinking differently, or thinking from the sense of our indigenous selves, for us to be able to go out and relate with others from a position of strength. So I don't know whether I'm answering the question, but that's what I'm hoping that my research is going to invoke in people, so that they can, even if it's a few people who can pass on this knowledge. I can report that when I was interviewing some young people, I was actually very impressed, because it's beginning to happen. And some of them told me, you know what? I always felt this, but I did not know what it was. So probably providing people with the language and the opportunity to have a language, to be able to articulate this thing that is actually inside them. It has not been lost, it just has been subsumed by colonialism. I know for people like me in the diaspora who is not rooted, who is not physically in Africa, we also need to think about how do we remain connected to our lands. And I think there's, I think it's Professor Day or somebody who has written and said that Africa resides in you. It does not, you know, you carry it with you. It's embodied. You have that embodied knowledge of your identity as an African person, but it is also invoking that identity wherever you are in the diaspora, whether you are a local diaspora, people from Gikuyu, for example, living in other parts of Kenya, or whether it's a person like me living in Canada. Just invoking that indigeneity within ourselves. And indigeneity is rooted. It is rooted in a specific place, not everywhere. So you really have to connect with the land where you are from, and from which gives you that identity. And that is critically important. And again, that is why, for me, invoking my indigeneity is critical to my research.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, Jacques Diop also said, Africa lives in you. You don't need to be on the continent of Africa to be rooted to it. And also, the way you articulated your answer is extremely well in terms of they might have colonized our mind, but we still have our mind. So we can have a shift of consciousness. And as you said in your, when you're interviewing young people, there are lots of young people who are starting to awaken. So thank you so much. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, Professor Anne.
Thank you so much, Wambui. I do see just one final question that maybe we can touch on, and then we can probably say goodbye. But the question says, can you remind me of the year you felt that British colonization was achieved? I think you mentioned it. What do you feel the year that the British colonization was achieved?
I think the British colonization was achieved in Kenya. I think there were many pathways to how they achieved that. There was the legal, the use of British colonial laws, the use of violence that I spoke about. But I think the final achievement of British colonial rule was Kenya's independence and the way it was orchestrated, because there was such a huge opportunity missed in decolonizing the country, or you know, lessing British colonial rule. And even though Kenya's independence in 1963 was touted as independence, and it's true, the British left, some British left. There are still a lot of them that remained in Kenya, and who Professor Anne has spoken about, own huge tracts of land even up to today, that you travel for miles and miles and miles and miles. And it's just one colonialist land. And you start thinking about who owned this land before. The local people who were herdsmen, whose cattle used to graze on those lands, where did they go? Where, because this land is now enclosed, what about the medicinal plants inside there? What about the local knowledges that are reposed in those forests, in the people who live there? What about the physicality of the land itself? The grave sites that are in there, where people would have gone to commune with their ancestors. What has when this land becomes encroached, and we are talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of land that used to belong to so many families, how it's unfathomable. And that is just one piece. And we can talk of land in Nanyuki. We can talk of land in places like on your way to Nakuru. Professor Wan knows of those places. And I think the Liu colonization in Kenya, apart from those physical acts of violence and whatever, was the colonization of the mind, when the British were able to colonize our minds such that we stopped being ourselves. And I see that as the main opportunity that was lost. When Kenya became independent or gained its independence in 1963, the people who became rulers were actually living in Europe, had lived in Europe, and had been trained to think differently. So when they were taken to the Lancaster House conference to debate whatever they were going to debate about how this independence was going to be crafted, they were not, the mindset was not to actually do anything that would benefit. It was not a question of going back to our own indigenous selves. It's a question of how can we still advance British colonial interests using you as the tools, the Black people, white masks, the whatever. Yeah, using that as a paradigm. So I think that is when the Liu colonization happened, when they were able to convince us that they would do better for us than we could do for ourselves. And I think that pivotal point was the point when Kenya's independence was being crafted. So that's just my view. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
The loss of identity and the loss of self was the most critical colonizing thing. The violence we could withstand, but the colonization of our minds was the main point.
Thank you so much, Wambui, for that response. There's so much to think about and to explore. I think we're all going to leave here inspired to kind of think about the land that we're on ourselves, wherever we are. So thank you so much, Wambui, for presenting today, and everyone for coming. I think that we've gone a little over time, but it's been so wonderful. We always wish we had some more, but wishing everyone such a lovely afternoon. I'll keep the Zoom open just in case anyone has a final thoughts or greetings. Thank you.
Thank you so much.